I'm Doug Armato from the University of Minnesota Press, and I'd like to thank the Walker Arts Center and our publishing partner eFlux for inviting us to collaborate in the programming and presentation of this wonderfully provoking symposium. Since the early 1980s, the University of Minnesota Press's mission is centered on the re-examination and challenging of political, social, cultural, aesthetic, philosophic, and scientific orthodoxies. And at the forward edge of that overall project for the past decade has been the Posthumanities series, edited by Cary Wolfe, who we will now hear in conversation with one of the series' most far-reaching authors, Timothy Morton. Cary Wolfe holds the Bruce and Elizabeth Dunleavy Chair in English at Rice University and is founding director of 3CT, the Center for Critical and Cultural Theory. He is the author-editor of several influential books, including What is Posthumanism and, most recently, Before the Law. Timothy Morton is Rita Shea Guffey Chair in English, also at Rice University, and the author of many books, including Hyperobjects in Cary's Posthumanities series, as well as Ecology Without Nature and Dark Ecology. Tim has collaborated with artists including Björk, Haim Stanbach, and Olafur Eliasson. Tim and Cary.
Okay.
It's us.
Still standing or sitting.
The mansplainers.
Yeah.
Two bearded guys from Rice explaining what it all really means. Thank you for laughing.
But because this is not our first rodeo, as they say in Houston, we know that we've been set up, so we're going to change it up a little bit. What you're looking at behind us is a stop-action video that Tim actually made. We're on the board of a journal called Environmental Humanities, and when that was launched, they sent out some prompts and asked the board members to, do something, write something or whatever. So we went to our favorite bar and had a conversation that we recorded, and we've got the sound turned down because it's very loud and cacophonous, but then Tim had this idea to build this stop-action video, which was excruciatingly difficult to do, I'm sure, around it.
Hence the fact that it's a little bit crap.
Yeah. But we knew at this point, this is what a friend of mine who goes to the MLA convention calls it's the fall of Saigon session. So like the helicopters are leaving and you're like, we've been here for 2 days, you're like get us out, we got to go. So we figured if we ran the video, it would give you guys something to be bemused by and keep you awake while we do our thing. Anyway, so we're just going to loop that behind us. It goes about 15 minutes and it'll just keep rolling. So we made kind of an executive decision that we were supposed to talk for 30 minutes and then give you guys 10 minutes, but we're going to kind of flip that around so that we're not in the position that we're set up to be in this event. And you've been talked at for 2 days, so it might be cool for you guys to be able to talk to us and talk to each other about what you've seen in the exhibition and also what you've heard in the papers and conversations. So we're just going to make a very few remarks, although we're both very long-winded, as you can already tell. So that might stretch out a little bit. But I just want to say, first of all, I have been a fan of the Walker since the 70s. I'm so proud to be here. I love this place. Working with University of Minnesota Press has been one of the great pleasures of my adult professional life. The amount of freedom that I've been given by the press and by Doug especially has resulted in an amazing series of books, even if I am the editor, I have to say. We just published volume 39. And one thing I think that the Posthumanities series and what's going on here has in common is that, the Avant Museology volume is volume 1 of this new series, eFlux Classics. And I just think it's so cool that eFlux is doing this because when we launched the Posthumanities series in 2007, I made a very calculated decision to have the first volume be a book that many of you probably know about from the early 1980s, a book called The Parasite by Michel Serres. And what I was trying to do was to send a signal that the post of Posthumanities emphatically does not mean, because it was written last week, it's way cooler than something that was written 40 years ago, right? And this has, I think, everything to do with what we've been talking about for the past couple of days, in the relationship between work that's past and work that's present. And I think of that relationship as a recursive, ongoing, dynamic, and recursive relationship in which, we're in a position now to see things about work that was done in the past that we couldn't have seen 30 years ago. So to give you another example from the series, we did this weird little book by Jacques Derrida called Cinders that even a lot of kind of hardcore Derrida fans haven't read. It's really short. It was actually kind of a script for a conversation on French radio with some like weird classical music playing in the background. It was published in the early 80s as well, but the sender of the title is kind of like the Trace on steroids, really, is what the sender is for Derrida. And so, when this book was published in 1982, I think it was, in French, we didn't have 35 years of biopolitical discourse in the rearview mirror, especially Giorgio Agamben's foregrounding of the Nazi death camps as kind of Exhibit A in his version of biopolitical thought. And so now when you go to Cinders, and there's all this stuff about flame and ashes and ghost and all this sort of stuff, it's just a completely different book from its original incarnation. And we've done this with other titles in the series. We did a new translation of Jacob von Uexküll's very famous text that we translated as a foray into the worlds of humans and animals, and that's a landmark text from 1934 in theoretical biology. Most of you probably know of Uexküll's work because it's referred to in A Thousand Plateaus by Deleuze and Guattari, the anecdote about the tick that they latch onto and get very obsessed with. Agamben actually also in The Open mentions the text as what he calls a watershed text in modern anti-humanism, as he puts it. So we've got a series of titles in the Posthumanities series that are trying to engage in, I think, a very similar project that we've been doing here and that eFlux is doing with the volume just published, which is to make the point, as Tim and I have been talking about the past couple of days, that the relationship between work in the past and work in the present is a very alive, very dynamic, very recursive and creative, I think, relationship. And I just want to thank places like the Walker and places like University of Minnesota Press for providing the kind of institutional space in which that conversation has a lot more traction, I think, and is able to go in a lot more directions than it could otherwise. And so where we've ended up at this point, I think, over the past couple of days is different versions and different dress rehearsals, I think, and we've heard different flavors of it in different media of how that relationship might unfold, both in different kinds of relationships to institutions, sometimes fraught and critical relationships to institutions, and sometimes ones that depend upon institutions. And so Tim and I have been talking about what is the relationship between all of that and something that's central to our work, which is really the place of the non-human in the kind of work that we do and in non-human life, whether that's animal life, object life, ecological life, and so on. And I think we both felt like that dimension of the conversation kind of just started to enter pretty late in the game, I think. And so we wanted to talk just a little bit about that, and I want to hear Tim's thoughts on this. And then we're going to probably cut pretty quickly to just hoping that we have a conversation with you, but also that the members of the audience can converse with each other about what we've seen over the last couple of days and about the exhibition as well. So Tim, you want to?
10-4. Hello. Fuck, we made it out of Scorpio. Jesus, I thought it was dying back there. So, and then there's another thought that occurs to me, which is, is there a past before November 9th? Does anyone remember a time before that? Thank you for laughing. You can sort of see my point here. And another thought was occurring to me, which is sort of like how many life forms went extinct in the last 2 days? This is not me doing a guilt thing. honestly, ecological talk is so about inducing guilt, and I'm so not into that. You know, you are not even remotely responsible as an individual human being for global warming. That's the paradox. When you start your car, it's statistically meaningless, actually. You know, but sort of scaled up to Earth magnitude, billions of those happening, is responsible for global warming. But actually, the thing that we should really be calling it is mass extinction, because that's like actually what's happening, you know, and it's sort of like the sixth biggest one on the planet. It's the sixth mass one, right? And it could be as big as the end Permian one. That was way bigger than the asteroid. The end Permian was another like global warming one, yeah. And it just wiped out all but 4% of life forms on Earth, right? And at this point, we are that. We are this super asteroid, like bigger than the thing that, like, we've all seen the thing on the telly where the thing goes and there's the shock wave and the flames and the dinosaurs running confused and all that, you know. Little mammals hiding, you know, who evolved into us and destroyed Earth. Thank you for sort of laughing. So, like, you know, how do we find some kind of wiggle room to, like, even just dream that and imagine that, you know? And I was so touched by Anton's film earlier. We haven't met yet. This is me saying hi, because your film was so incredibly beautiful. And there were two things about it that I really liked, actually. Number one was the sort of pervasive melancholia, right? This sort of melancholy feeling, which I take to be like a pretty default ecological awareness emotion, affect, whatever. You know, it's not the only one, but it's kind of default. You know, it's like it's where Wall-E lives. You know, Wall-E the robot. He's kind of like he's kind of a curator. You know, he's kind of a curator of stuff that he doesn't quite know what it's for, right? He just kind of like has it. You know, what's it for? And he thinks about it, and kind of like that leads me to think of a Bob Dylan line. Actually, I think maybe my favorite line of Bob Dylan, which is, "You never know how the past will turn out." Yeah, you never know how the past will turn out. And I think one of the interesting things that I saw in the film was a human being standing in front of a case with all of these ancestors, evolution ancestors. Although, of course, these would also include so-called human historical ancestors, in fact, literally. And that was a very, very interesting shot, because it actually showed you that the human being is actually part of this kind of symbiotic, I'm calling it now the symbiotic real. You know, it's this thing that we live in called the biosphere, yeah? And sort of like a species, to use that word, is kind of like a weird, like, ghostly spectral being. Like it is itself, but it's also kind of ghosted by these sort of ex-men, ex-woman, ex-chimp versions of itself, right? You know, like there's a fish, but it can breathe out of water for 30 seconds, right? And at that level, you can't tell if it's a monstrosity or a variation. That's only with like 20/20 hindsight, right? You never know how the past will turn out. And so something about the way that non-human beings in this space, but also just as a matter of fact, have this kind of spectral quality, you know, seems very important when it comes to thinking about the non-human beings that are like, you know, stuff that people have in museums and all that.
Can I ask you a really abstract question?
Do.
We were talking about this yesterday, and it's really a question that I have about the kind of the mise en scène of the vehicle of the esprit de corps idea in relation to a certain configuration and maybe domestication of space. That I think you felt like the piece with the blinds or the shades.
Oh, Philippe's piece, Rhino's piece.
Yeah, that everybody thought, well, these things are just malfunctioning, but it turns
systemized.
out to be a piece of artwork.
Yeah, I did the classic thing. My friend Philippe's piece of artwork, and I did the Philistine thing. So, oh, these stupid curtains are malfunctioning, you know. So the funny thing is actually that we have this myth that things kind of function smoothly, and I really don't believe it. I think that's a myth, and I think that's really like anthropocentrically, humanly scaled, like idea that stuff is kind of functioning smoothly. And ecological awareness definitely means stuff is malfunctioning, right, in our world. But that basically reveals a sort of secret truth, which is that kind of like all the way down, everything is kind of malfunctioning, both in the sense of like intrinsically fragile, finite and broken, but also in the sense of the mal, like in the Les Fleurs du Mal, sort of slightly evil, yeah, because like, and you don't have to believe this, but I think basically that causality is profoundly aesthetic. I think that basically what is called the aesthetic dimension is the causal dimension, and it's actually very straightforward contemporary science. That basically since Hume, we've been saying like, you don't really have access to things. What you have access to are data, right? And what you're looking at in science is patterns in data. And the last time I said this, it was in front of a whole bunch of engineers in Singapore. And I said something unwitting like, of course, that means that science is just really expensive music appreciation. And STEM is totally wrong and stuff. And they were a bit irritated by that, I have to say. So thanks for being less irritated by it, I hope, I think. But I want to point out, actually, while we're on the subject of me being the devil, that I do tend to say exactly the thing that shouldn't be said in any social situation. So if you're already thinking, oh my God, fuck this guy, it's a big problem for me. Like, it's sort of weird kind of Larry David thing where I end up saying, it's sort of like in every group there's a scapegoat wanted sign, wanted scapegoat, and I'm like Donkey in Shrek, like pick me, Has anybody got any questions?
Yeah, what do you guys want to talk about the talks or the show, or you can also just talk to each other and we'll just sit here and watch you talk, or you can ask us questions, whatever.
Just two styrofoam cups trying to make a difference.
We don't want to napalm you with theory is what we're trying to not do that. We actually just want to give you guys a chance to process, do something other than be talked at for 2 days. So questions you guys have or things you all want to, yeah. Yeah, okay. Yeah, no. Well, yeah, that's a good idea. I'll ask you a version of the question I just asked Tim, which is, this is an open question, but I'll unpack a little bit more what I was saying to Tim. That I felt like that there was a tension between Philippe's piece and the esprit de corps vehicle and the configuration of space. Within a very sort of human ocular scale. I mean, I think a scalar way is the easiest way to think about this difference or this tension. And so one reason I think to put the question of the non-human and of non-human life on the table is I have found it easier in my teaching and working with students and so on to put this in biological terms and to say, look, if you take any particular space and you think about how it is shared by all the different forms of life that exist in that space, including, of course, the multitude of ones that you can't see, and you realize that their phenomenological experience of that space, this goes back to optical stuff on the tick that I was talking about earlier, which is why Deleuze and Guattari are so excited about it. If you realize that their configuration of that space phenomenologically is a product of their own autopoiesis, of what Maturana calls their embodied in action, then what it means is any space is a virtual space because it's a series of concatenated, partially overlapping, but non-totalizable, non-congealing perceptual worlds that different creatures co-build. And sometimes they structurally couple and build them in ways that are visible and obvious, and sometimes they don't. So really, my sort of question, and I think Walid's work was really interesting in this regard, and also pressed up against the esprit de corps idea in a different way, because that work and his description of his work in general is precisely about existing in a virtual space, existing in a multidimensional space. Not all of which, maybe even most of which, is not apparent to us. And not apparent because we're too stupid or we're not looking hard enough. But, as Derrida puts it, invisible on principle, right? It's not something that hasn't been seen yet. It is something that is literally unseeable. And so one of the things, this turned out not to be a question, but more an answer to the question I was going to ask you, is really, I've been thinking about the tensions that exist in that sort of mise en scène that frames the show, and pieces in the show that reproduce it, but also, I think, push up against it. And I would be actually really interested to hear, different people's experiences of how that works in the show, and also different pieces in the show. I mean, for me, Nina Byer's piece with the dogs, right? The big porcelain dogs and the vases, is kind of emblematic of what could be read as a kind of domestication of that multidimensional virtual space that I think that vehicle makes possible, but isn't exhausted by that by any means, right? So, and because I found the show, diverse enough that I'm kind of reluctant to really generalize about it. I don't have kind of a total take on the show because I just found the work in the show so diverse. I mean, Tim, I don't know if you.
No, I'm gonna have you been having a nice time? I can't think of any really great question, but maybe we'll start there. Hey, yeah.
We should probably
We're going to need to be a
hear
little
from,
bit fast on the mics if we're going to turn this into a little seminar thing.
Well, we should probably hear from the Walker folks about that. They know more about this than I do. I'm just kind of working off of the exhibition guide.
Can you repeat the question?
I was just curious about this esprit de corps vehicle. I didn't encounter that.
You guys the Walker
model.
folks want to unpack that for us? There are people here who work for the Walker, I think. We've already run them off. Okay. What happens next? Well, okay. I guess they're not going to jump in on this.
Is it in the parking garage?
No, I mean it's actually in the exhibition catalog, and it's the vehicle for the whole idea of Question the Wall itself, which is using a certain configuration of interior, kind of explicitly interior space, to raise questions about identity, phenomenology, political formations, and so on, as you move through the works in the exhibition. And it's taken from a phrase by Broadterres, whose work is also in the exhibition, and serves as a kind of frame for holding together this to me pretty serious diversity of work, and trying to, I think really explicitly relocate indoors, as it were, the question of the political, right? And the kind of the stakes that we've been talking about.
Hey, I got a question.
Yeah.
Boom. So,
Tim has a question.
To you, given what we've been sharing the last couple of days, what is like Avant? What does it mean? Because I'm actually a bit puzzled.
Other than weird shit from the Soviet Union. What else is on the menu?
Like, for example, does it mean like wipe everything out and like start again? Or does it mean like being in the front, like the vanguard of what? In front of what, right? What army are we in front of? What does it mean? Before, does it mean? Could it mean invisible?
Is it originally a military term?
We're going to need the mic to be flying around here, because
Yeah.
people deserve to be recorded.
Yeah. Well, one possibility that was mentioned, one question was, does it mean invisible, right? That was your, or could it mean? Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Said it now. So.
Yeah. I don't know, Tim. I to me, it in principle means something like invisible. To go back to what I was talking about, with the Posthumanities series, that, these books, these objects, these fetish items that end up in museums or end up in libraries, are, I think, in the sense I was trying to describe, they're virtual objects, and they're multidimensional objects. Right?
Yeah, to me, the invisible kind of suggests a word that I like to use, which is futurality. Yeah, that's like the possibility of future at all. Like above and beyond like predictable future. The way in which things can be open, like this thing here is called Tim is open, right? Like there's so much more in here that isn't Tim than Tim, right? And there are so many things that can like happen, and Tim explaining himself will never be like, Tim. It'll just be like Tim explanation, right? And then Tim like licking himself to find out what he's like is just going to be a Tim lick, right? And then like Tim doing a drawing of himself is going to be a Tim drawing. I'm never going to get even me myself, I'm never going to get the actual me. I'm never going to coincide with that, right? And to me, that's the future for real. And so that kind of means that any entity whatsoever, a dog, a quasar, a football team, is kind of like a junction, like a train junction, right? Where past and future are sliding over one another without touching, right? And the form of the thing is the past, which is a potentially infinite abyss of contextual references that are included in the thing, right? Like my face is like a map of everything that happened to my face, right? So that's sort of like the past, and of course, it's not over yet, right? And then there's the futurality quality, which to me would be the invisibility, right? Which is this sort of openness, yeah? And that's what the thing actually is, right? When I say thing, don't get hung up on it. Entity, thing, whatever, person, sometimes I just say person now. So like, somehow art is a place in our world, aka neoliberal whatever, where we somehow slightly still allow things like that to happen, right? Where you can sort of see how a thing is like a junction on a railway line, where the past is sliding over the future without touching, and that what we call present is just a reification of this weird relative motion between the past and the future, this kind of queasy sensation that we have, of sort of evaporating, expanding. I really like what Beth was saying about pushing and kind of pulling at the same time, like that sort of pull focus feeling, yeah? And sort of we allow that to happen to ourselves in here.
Yeah, I think Beth's description of how the films work is precisely that. I mean, it's a version, I think, in a way, of what Michel Serres called a quasi-object, which is, again, it's a kind of it's a material point, but it's a vanishing point for the kind of futurality or the kind of the effects in the world that Beth was talking about in her. And giving us the stacked deck of the two options, the one of which we knew you were going to gravitate toward. But I thought that was a really great description of the dynamic character, the dynamic quality of these things that we too easily think of as fixed or inert, and fetishize, accordingly. So, one cool thing about I think about what's going on in science right now is that it really makes it easy to understand in a more concrete way everything that Tim just said. Think about all the work going on in epigenetics and the microbiome, that's finally bringing us out of 30 years of reductive materialism and into an understanding of exactly what Tim just said, which is that, what we call the human is this blunt instrument and foreshortened blind, description of something that another vocabulary can give a much more robust account of. And it doesn't mean evacuating the specificity of what it means to be human in different cultural and anthropological contexts. It just means that that's only a very small tip of the iceberg of the actual dynamic physical reality of who you are.
Yeah, tip of the iceberg. I'm a holist, yeah. I am a holist, but I can control it. But like, to me, most like vanilla holism is basically like monotheism, kind of like we're retweeting it all the time, when we say things like the whole is always greater than the sum of its parts. It's like there's no big reason for that. And I love this tip of the iceberg image, because what that's sort of suggesting is that, like, okay, so Tim is a whole, but there's so much more in Tim than Tim, right? So Tim is actually less than the sum of its parts, and it's very useful to know that. Like, neoliberalism may cover the surface of Earth, right? Physically, it's massive and horrifying, but right now, you kind of need to remember, ontologically, it's tiny. Ontologically, there's just one of it, and there's so much more. Like, for example, weather and climate. Obviously, weather is a symptom of climate. Don't get me wrong when I say what I'm about to say, right? Weather is a symptom of global warming for sure, but global warming is less than the sum of its parts. Like, there's so much more that weather can do than just be a symptom of global warming. Weather can be this incredible, like, bath for these toads who are about to lay these eggs in it. You know, weather can be this really beautiful sensation on my arm, right? Weather can be this kind of thing that I'm talking about to exemplify that how things are always less than the sum of their parts, right? And so, like, art is sort of that, right? It's sort of like something out of which is always bursting a kind of bag full of something else, right? And when you take the anthropocentric, like, scaling off, it has a slight, like, fringe of, like, weird or disgusting or uncanny or something like that you can't really delete from it or something.
Okay, so now that we've done exactly what we said we would not do, are there any questions? There's one.
Yesterday we heard Hito Steyerl talk about the art institution in the context of planetary civil war. I'm wondering, Timothy, if you can speak of the art institution in the context of the sixth mass extinction, maybe.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, why not? I can do that. Yeah. Oh, the dilithium crystals, Jim. You know, I don't know. Like, well, yeah. I mean, the whole idea is that, you know, like I'm saying, a museum is a place where you get to notice that the past isn't over yet. Yeah, in all kinds of ways, right? Like the traumatic, you know, oppressive aspect of that, and the kind of strange, weird, minor key wiggle room aspect of that at the same time, right? And then it's also a place where, you know, you notice that there's this futurality, there is a possibility of the future, right? Right now, my friends, which is basically the left, you know, very broadly considered to mean anybody slightly to the left of W at this point, is going through this narcissistic frenzy of, like, devouring itself, like, let's get exactly the right way of thinking about stuff, and, oh, it's your fault, it's him, it's there, it's her, they did it, right? And it's just this kind of, like, self-devouring machination that bears an uncanny resemblance to the self-devouring machination that's about to sit in the White House, yeah? So my whole shtick right now is I give up, I surrender. I don't care anymore about anything like pimp my access, which is cool because that's kind of like my philosophical MO, right? Like this whole notion that we've been dealing with, which roughly is like how we've been thinking about the avant-garde for 100 years, is this notion of if we can just get the access mode right, we can change stuff, right? And it's like every access mode so far has had various problems associated with it, but the main problem is that you've got two faders in contemporary life, right? You've got your correlator and you've got your correlatee. You've got your access mode and you've got your thing that you're accessing, yeah? And we've turned the volume way, way down on the correlatee, and we've turned it way, way up on pimp my access. You know, like every other Facebook post is Facebook is like 52%. You know, Pimp My Guild, which is a version of Pimp My Access, and like 48% cats on scooters, yeah. And I'm in the cats on scooters camp, you know, because it's sort of which one is more ideological actually. You know, obviously they form some kind of duality, right? But like somehow it's time to start turning up the volume on the correlatee, right? The thing that we're accessing. And again, don't get hung up on this word thing, right? And sort of like, I don't mind. Like we could spend, this is the mansplaining problem. So like, well, this way of accessing the stuff would be a good, when like you're not looking at it properly, you should look at it like this, because that's a much better way. Which kind of weirdly defaults to like a cool kid art school version of the guy who was like the MC of Woodstock. You know, like the thing at Woodstock where the guy was like, if we just think really hard, like hard enough, maybe the rain will stop.
I think I have kind of I guess a humanist question, since it seems like you're both humanists. This idea, as it goes back to this idea of the archive, and thinking about the idea of immortality and how this relates to, you see where I'm going with this?
I see where you're going with this.
And how this relates to this idea of the machine, and how one can, we're starting to think about this idea of how we can upload our consciousness to the machine, and how that references to the archive, and also this idea of immortality and death, and that that your body might die, but your mind lives on, and therefore knowledge is endless, etc.
I'm going to say one small thing, and then I'm going to let Kerry handle this. Okay, but like one really cool thing that I loved about your film was that it gave me a way to enjoy transhumanism in this kind of weirdly spectral, melancholic way that I've never enjoyed it before, because the way I've normally experienced it has been like 300 years from now, some poor person opens up the cryogenic suspension chamber that used all this energy and was like, oh my God, it's Ray Kurzweil. Oh, wow, my life is complete. You know, and Ray's like, you know, when I finally manage to upload myself, and when there's like a memory computing power and a blood cell type size thing of an iPhone, then I will be able to be truly compassionate. Until then, I'm obviously going to hold off on the compassion thing until I've upgraded myself to this sort of heavenly place where I can be omnipotent and omniscient and just retweeting axiolate religion, and that sucks.
I guess the most straightforward way to answer your question is I'm deeply dubious about the Ray Kurzweil transhumanist sort of project for lots of different reasons, some of them pragmatic, some of them political in a pretty identifiable way, some of them sort of theoretical and philosophical. But and it's not because I'm hung up on carbon-based life forms. I mean, to me, the material substrate in and through which the relationship between freedom and finitude plays itself out is not that important. And I see no reason in principle that this should be limited to carbon-based life forms at all. And of course, sci-fi people have been all over this forever. I mean, one of the great episodes of Star Trek Next Generation is when Data argues before a court for his right to not be disassembled. Right, and it's a fantastic example of how what's complicated theoretically about the problem is how does the recursive relationship, the evolutionary recursive dynamic relationship of an autopoietic entity, carbon-based or not, produce all the stuff that we're interested in ethically, politically, phenomenologically, ontologically, which is not reducible to that material substrate, right? For that, I think you need a pretty complicated theoretical explanation of why that stuff matters. And so to me, Heidegger was right when he said the being of beings is not a being, right? I think that's right. What he was wrong about is that problem coincides in any meaningful way with the distinction between human beings and other forms of life.
And German human beings and other forms of
and German human beings and other forms of life. I mean, you know, I think it's safe to say at this point, the human/animal distinction, which is really a hierarchy, or just the human/everything else distinction, you know, is worse than a blunt instrument. I mean, the first thing you have to do is throw that out and declare it, as Derrida puts it, it's actually asinine, right? To try to think these problems through that kind of really primitive philosophical and theoretical machinery. And so, to me, the question you're raising then, in terms of the material substrate, is, I think, in principle, always going to be an open question, right? The philosophical side of it, I think, has to do with the relationship between freedom and finitude. And I think the Kurzweilian transhumanist project gets the relationship between freedom and finitude exactly ass backwards, right? Which is to say that freedom depends upon finitude, right? It essentially depends upon finitude and depends upon limitation, not transcending and escaping finitude, right? Exactly the opposite.
Playing with it. It's sort of like, speciesism and racism are deeply intertwined, obviously, right? And like, so racism and speciesism make the concept of person super, super expensive. And what's really cool about AI in a way is that it makes you realize that person is very, very cheap, right? And that like, so therefore you can like apply it to like everything, and therefore you can like have solidarity with like bunny rabbits and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, another way to put this is simply that if you could transcend all finitude, you would precisely have no freedom of thought in relation to the object world. You would simply be a passive registration mechanism, and not even you'd be a trivial one, not a non-trivial one, as systems theory puts it, for just registering passively a one-to-one relationship with the object world. And that means you have no creativity, that means you have no freedom. So in that sense, and Kant has interesting things to say about this actually, in that sense, freedom and finitude are two sides of the same coin. And so that's a different angle on the question that you were asking as well.
I have so many questions, I don't know where to start. But I had a really interesting conversation at lunch with these two guys over here, and this question came up that really stuck with me, which is what's the difference between a museum and a church? And your point about the past it's a place where the past isn't over yet made me think that again. And then also I'm kind of obsessed with loops now because Hito talked about loops, and so I'm thinking about these sort of like looping of the past and the present.
I'm a super duper loop fan, by the way. I'd like to do a shout out to loops. Somehow I'm into them. I think like the word weird comes from the Norse word meaning twisted in a loop, right? And it means both strange of appearance and like uncannily causal effect, right? And so like, funnily enough, that word really joins together the aesthetic and the causal in a way that I really, really like, and an awful lot of like, quote unquote Western civilization has been an attempt to like get rid of weirdness, and it's now, when scaled up to like Earth magnitude, this attempt to get rid of weirdness is now resulting in the 6th mass extinction event. Yeah. To me, a being is almost a kind of weird twisted loop, where like what a thing is and how it appears are like intertwined with one another inextricably, so that you can't actually peel off the appearance to get to like the bland vanilla substance that you can manipulate, right? Like, how's that idea been working out for 12,500 years, And sort of like, I like that. And so it precisely is a question about religion, actually, because like religion is like created by axial age, agricultural, like Mesopotamian type society, patriarchal hierarchy, right? And it's like just like one guy, like the 1%, they very, very quickly was created the 1%, and that guy's called the king, and the king's got the bat phone to the invisible version of him in the sky who wants to kill you, and it's sort of like, that's not great, and like, that's where we know how the past turned out, that's kind of like, that's the oppressive bit, as far as I'm concerned, and I think like, truly, religion is, and like theism in particular, are like, deeply, deeply like, retweeted especially by people who think that they're like outside of it. There's like obviously a whole kind of state ideology, religion thing that we're going through right now. Like, you must sit back and rubberneck the thing that's going on like a deer in the headlights, like one of Cary's infinity beings that can't do anything. That's like an observatory in your movie there. Like, because it's all sacred all of a sudden. Like, you just got to like accept it and watch it. It's like, no, fuck off.
I've written a lot about loops because I've written a lot about systems theory, first order and second order systems theory, so-called. You can't really understand anything, I think, about dynamic developmental processes, especially in biology and in evolution, without talking about loops. The complicated thing about talking about loops is you realize very quickly that you got to be able to understand how to talk about systems that are both open and closed at the same time, right? And so the sort of first generation systems theory cybernetics people, Gregory Bateson is an important figure to me. His book Steps to an Ecology of Mind. And they laid down across many different disciplines the paradigm of the feedback loop, of which there are two types, positive and negative feedback. And that was fine and useful for thinking across what we used to think were separate ontological domains and being able to show how thermoregulation in warm-blooded animals is like how the cruise control on your car works, right? And then eventually be able to show how synapses have only an on and an off in the same way that we can map across, digital binary code of ones and zeros. So all of a sudden it's like, wow, we have this powerful, because of loops, we have this powerful theoretical machinery. The problem is that kind of fell back into a kind of a holism that Bateson never really figured out how to talk about. And this comes back actually to my thing about finitude earlier. Second generation systems theory really emphasizes the contingency of the map or the code that makes the loop run, right? And that contingency, that finitude, turns out to be a reservoir actually of complexity. This goes back to what I was saying about virtuality earlier. So Niklas Luhmann has a really Zen-like way of putting this, which is reality is what one does not perceive when one perceives it, right? Because the very thing that enables you to cognitively, mentally approach an Umwelt, a life world, whether that's language or some other representational map, is the very thing that, because of its contingency, also is always going to push part of that world and part of that environment outside. And that's not a limitation, that's a good thing. Because only then other observers using other maps and other codes have to be called into the conversation, right? There is no Archimedean point from which everything can be mapped and totalized. And so for me, that when we're talking about loops, that's kind of the stakes of the difference between sort of first order or first generation systems theory and how it theorizes loops and second order systems theory. And it comes back to this question about finitude and the relationship of finitude and freedom and complexity that we were talking about earlier.
So one more thing, okay, so I'm just going to be a bit bold and say, no, a museum is not a church. And also, actually, quite frankly, a church is not a church either. Because a church is always less than the sum of its parts, right? There's so many more things you can do with it. It can be a landing strip for a fly, a church could be. It could be a place where that you ignore, that you just walk past, right? All these access modes, like landing and brushing and licking and ignoring and drawing and stuff, are also perfectly valid, and thinking is not the top one, right? But if it is a church, then at the absolute worst, it's a church with a whole bunch of different religions in it, all clashing, so they reveal their inner kind of fracturedness. I like museums, apparently.
I mean, I guess they'll tell us when to stop. We'll just keep going until they do.
Sounds good. More about loops. And going back to your question about what and where is the Avant now, as we've been sort of hearing and talking about in the last 2 days, if we're in a feedback loop now, as Hito Starl talked about, we're in, a video game level that just keeps going and going, and, maybe we need to go online and find the cheat, find the weapon and a thing. If that's the situation, then where is the Avant, and what is it? Or does it exist anymore?
I'm going to be a little tiny bit... Now, this is where I get to be the devil. Okay, just brace for impact. Yeah? We are not in a video game to that extent that... that is a very theistic way of looking at the world. Who gets to hide these little tools that I'm supposed to find? And how come I'm going up? And how do I know I'm going up? And well, because I'm in a game, and the game is telling me you're going up, right? There's this whole gamification phenomenon where corporations are trying to oppress us even more by turning our lives into fun. And one of the things that they do now is mindfulness, which is sort of this incredible make-work project to turn you into a kind of frantic person, totally concerned with, again, pimping their access, all the time. Terribly calm, psychopaths are the most mindful people on the planet, if you think about it, right? Like, awareness is where it's at, right? Awareness, like a totally unconditional, open, playful, right? Like, there's a difference between gamification and play, right? Like playing a video game to level up, or playing like, just like, maybe I could switch it off. I've got the controls, actually. You have got the controls, guys. Like, I'm an anarchist, yes, so I'm basically saying, you've got the controls, right? And one of the things you can do is switch it off, because there's so much more of you than there is of the whole that we're in, right? And so, like, one thing we could do on stage would be like, I'm holier than thou, which basically means I'm cynicaler than thou, which basically means my, like, paralyzing picture of how fucked we are is much worse than yours, therefore I'm more intelligent than you. Right, like, oh, it's not even as bad, as good as that. Check out how oppressive I'm going to make it in my answer, right? And it's like, this is how we've been performing being right for the last 200 years. It's like, I've got a better access mode than you, and it defaults to cynical reason, and it's deeply oppressive. And how come the left argued itself into a position where, like, describing how bad everything is like the best way to, like, be nice to, like, working people and, like, whatever.
I have nothing to add.
Thank you.
Hi, can you talk about the difference between an object and a human being?
Okay, so when you hear the word
Yes,
object,
he can.
Yeah. Yes, I can. Oh, yes, we can. I remember that. That was before the 9th, wasn't it? Something about that was said. I'm sure I remember hearing somewhere, yes, we can. Yeah. So, okay, so like when you hear me say the word object, you see in that...
I understand the way you're using it.
Yeah.
I understand the way you're
Right. An object... So there isn't a difference then, and there isn't one. An object, a human is an object, a rabbit is an object, anything that has a difference between what it is and how it appears is an object. So there's no difference. But the trouble is that some of us, when you hear that word, you see, like in a mirror, the worst possible thing that could happen to you, because unfortunately we're still retweeting this Neoplatonic action theory that makes this very big distinction between active and passive. And it's one thing that we have to figure out if we're going to do a revolution here, is to have a different theory of action than this kind of extremely kind of patriarchal event stuff where we're just like deciding who gets to cut into the continuum and all that kind of stuff. Because that's just basically Neoplatonic Christianity, you know?
I just read a good Christian Boltanski quote where he talks about a person being a human until he, cracks them in the head, right? And then they're an object.
Yeah, that's the one I'm not doing.
Right.
So to me, I'm using it in a totally lame-ass, floppy
Yeah.
way, like, and you can say entity or being or whatever way it works, like, to not make that sound horrible.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I would add is this is why I think I prefer Tim's version of this to some other versions that are out there that have been associated or have been called kind of flat ontology. I think it points in exactly the opposite direction, which is a much more complex, uneven, jagged field of different kinds of being in the world, in ways that I just think we have maybe a better language to talk about now than we used to. And again, that doesn't evacuate. It's not anti-humanist in the sense of, oh, now we realize humanism is bullshit and we're the cool ones and we can move on. It actually means that I think we're able to have a much more multidimensional and much more robust description of what human beings, and I'm actually really, by the way, footnote, reluctant to generalize about human beings, okay? But let's just say for the purposes of argument, I do think we have a more robust vocabulary to talk about what human beings actually are, how they actually get on in the world, right? The different components and dimensions that make possible this thing we call human, right? Which is really a self-ascription based on a very thin sliver of our experience that's something like consciousness, right? But as we were talking about earlier, from a kind of object point of view, the only way that you get to have consciousness to worry about all this other stuff is by means of all these other processes which have nothing to do with the human and are not human, right?
So-
They're concatenated material processes that can eventuate in, but don't have to eventuate in, this thing we call human. And I think already then you just have a stronger way of describing what's going on, right?
So can you talk a bit about interactionism?
Can you say more about what that is? So the ignorant person. What is it?
I guess I've heard it. I've heard it explained as interactionism, or I mean, define.
I know what you're talking about, Karen. You're talking about Karen Barad, interaction, right? Right? So that's the cool thing about that Karen Barad's concept. It's not inter, actually. It's intra.
Right. People
And
say it differently
intra-
depending on who you're reading.
Right on. But the point about intra is it means within, right? And so like she's using quantum theory, right? So like imagine the universe can be described using just one wave function, which is basically what you can do in quantum theory, right? It's just a giant wave, right? And like I'm a little certain kind of ripple on the ocean and you're another kind of little ripple on the ocean, and like we're basically like ripples on the ocean of this gigantic wave, right? Now, what's happening inside that wave is causality, right? It's intra-action, right? And so like the wave can be yellow, it can be red, it can be blue. It's always very, very specific, right? There's no such thing as like a totally transparent, unmarked, bland, vanilla sort of wave, right? And so sort of like, I think we're all kind of saying the same thing roughly, you know, and I'm like really super loath right now. I'm so sorry, just one more thing, because this is, you're really asking fantastic question. The narcissism of small differences is like why the left is now chewing its arms off. And so I'm so not willing to like distinguish what I think from Karen right now.
Okay, so from what little I understand of this idea, which I've just begun to try to wrap my head around, it's that particles are not stable, right?
Mm-hmm.
That they aren't this solid thing that just exists
Right on.
permanently in a particular state, but that they are actually affected by and always changing and responding to their historical, cultural moment.
Love it. And you know what else is cool? As far as quantum theory goes, when you isolate a thing, AKA in physical terms, you put it in a vacuum as close to absolute zero as possible, you observe this thing shimmering without mechanical input. In other words, it doesn't even require another entity to push it, right? And like, so what's that saying? Profoundly what it's saying is that causality is not mechanical. It's not underneath appearances, it's in front of appearances, and we call this region in front of appearances the aesthetic dimension, right? Like, think about your favorite painting, right? Like, you just got non-locally influenced by something that isn't even in this room, that you may not even have seen, that might not even exist, right? And so the point is, like, things move all by themselves, and like the quantum of movement is actually a kind of shimmering quality, right? And so like the quantum of action is more like what happens in appreciation, you know, than like doing something, you know. So like if you quantize action down to like the uncuttable bit, it's actually weirdly more like standing in a museum looking at Philippe Parena's blinds going up and down, you know. And sort of like this appreciation is a kind of quivering stillness. It's not completely static, right? And so solidity isn't quite the thing. It's more like liquid almost, you know. But sort of like the most important thing is that they're not being pushed. Things are not being pushed. Things are just kind of doing that all by themselves, you know. And like if I die in the next 5 minutes, could you put that on my gravestone, please? Because that like sums it up. Like objects shimmer without mechanical input. Yeah, it sounds a bit bland when you put it that way, but like that's how you can like, you know, change society and stuff. If you really, really think about it for like years and shit.
I guess we can keep going, right?
So it seems
One
like
or two more, yeah?
seems like your dismissal of the left is hinged upon the Second International and does not understand contemporary politics at all, So when you're dismissing left, you're dismissing
I'm so
Black
not
Lives
dismissing,
Matter.
dude.
Wait
I'm not
for me to
dismissing.
talk.
I'm not
Wait for me to
dismissing.
talk.
Of course. Go, please.
So when you're dismissing the left, you're dismissing Black Lives Matter, you're dismissing a lot of indigenous politics which is ongoing, you're dismissing anti-fascist politics. Do you think we're all chewing our arms off right now?
No, man, no, I'm doing
And
the opposite.
secondly, your comments on religion are kind of disturbing. It seems like the same version of Richard Dawkins, the same version of like young Hegelians who, like a high school kid who reads, gets his first kick of atheism and just thinks religion is.
No, definitely not, because that's a form of religion, actually. And you can prove it.
Go back to politics.
Yeah, let's do.
What do you understand?
So
about
I so
contemporary
want to
politics of
speak
the
to that.
left?
I so
And how
appreciate
does
that you
your
asked me that.
object-oriented philosophy
I so
help
appreciate
us
that.
towards
Thank
a new
you.
future, help us towards anti-fascism, help us towards
Thank you. Yes,
understanding racism?
absolutely. I think it can. Basically, like this is what the real problem that I'm talking about is like all of a sudden people forgetting about Black Lives Matter. Actually, like all of a sudden people are like, at least in my circle
You
of
have very
friends,
few friends on
turning
Facebook.
to Zizek to mansplain it for them, and like he's going, all that's just identity politics and it's irrelevant to like class stuff, and it's like, well, wait, like hang on, slow down. First of all, it's not identity politics, and like, how come we have to do this to ourselves? How come we have to like viciously like attack the way we were thinking about it and doing it like last week? If you sort of, so I'm actually completely on your side, dude. I'm speaking against the Hegelianism. That is precisely the bug in the kind of Marxist left system. And I think it's a bug, not a feature, but it's a bug that gives us this amazingly imperialistic anthropocentrism, right? When you take it out, all kinds of interesting things happen, right? So I'm writing a book for
kind of bug?
Verso
Could you
called
explain?
Humankind. That's what I'm trying to do to help people, because that's what I do mostly, is write sentences about ecological awareness. That's what I do, yeah? And like, the subtitle of this book is Solidarity with Non-Human People, right? And the idea is that like, the noise that the symbiotic real is making is that it's actually like below empathy. Like you don't even need to cook up the empathy, because basically symbiosis just is solidarity, right? And it's like super, super cheap and super, super easy to find. So let's go, And so I feel like, definitely this way of thinking can really help. But it's sort of like you take the Hegel out and you have to add a little bit of anarchism back in.
What exactly
right?
do you
And
mean
you
by
have to add a
Hegel?
little bit of
What
spectra.
exactly?
Well, you take the
how do you
teleological
identify-
stuff out, but you mostly take out the fact that Hegel, is freaked out about what Kant is saying, and he's basically saying that things are different from data, and so there's this crack in the real, and Hegel's like, actually there's no crack in the real because this idea is occurring in the transcendental subject, so I just made the problem go away because I'm Harold in the Purple Crayon, because I'm the one place in the universe that is actually embodying spirit, because I'm a human being, and in particular I'm a Prussian human being, and this little lovely thing that I discovered called the dialectic, when I scale it up to like macro Hegel, is like, weirdly the slinky actually goes upstairs, and it goes upstairs towards white Western patriarchy. And it's like, that sucks.
What are the concrete politics that you identify with Hegelianism today?
Sorry, I missed
What are
that.
the
Can you say
concrete
again?
politics that you identify with Hegelianism?
I'm so
like
sorry,
w-
I missed it again. Can you say?
What are the concrete politics that you understand by Hegelianism
Oh,
today?
but this is where I can't. I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to point right now, because right now we're doing this thing of like, it's you, and this way of doing it, and
But
it's
that's
all
what you've been
wrong,
doing all
yeah.
along. Why not just be
No, I'm
more
not-
concrete,
sorry, man,
clear, rather
Sorry
than
to be
abstract?
disappointing. I'm sorry
Yeah.
to be disappointing. My job is like how to think, not what to think. It's so awesome we can talk about this. I actually like, I really, really super appreciate it. Me,
No, we're good? Oh, okay. All right, cool. You got one more, you think? Okay, sure.
Just one more. Can you talk a little bit about what type of anarchy you mean when you're talking about when you say the word anarchy.
So
what-
sorry, where are you? Where are you?
Oh, hi.
Hello, hey,
Hi. Just tell me about your favorite kind of anarchy. Not the utopian kind.
Not the utopian kind? Like
Is
what?
that,
Like
is that your okay,
what
tell
is
me.
utopian? I'm sometimes very bad with words. Like you have to tell me what it means in this context. Like, what is utopian?
Just tell me about your favorite kind of anarchy.
My favorite kind of anarchy? Gosh. Well, I'm a bit perverted actually, because in this book I've combined Kropotkin, Bakunin, and like Stirner, and that's like a really strange, weird mixture. Like people, it's like they're totally freaky, yeah. But if you've got 5 hours, I can explain how those things really like go together into this lovely blend, you know. But Stirner's like kind of radical, you know. Individualism isn't quite the right word, you know. And like Kropotkin is all about like mutual aid, you know, and the fact that that is like not just a human being thing, but it's like across all kinds of life forms, yeah. And, you know, you've got your kind of anarcho-syndicalism thing going on, you know, which is about collectives, because like groups of people are also things, you know, like a football team is a thing, just like a football player is a thing. It's just that these things are less than the sum of their parts, so there can never be like a one-size-fits-all top-down umbrella solution, which doesn't mean that communism is wrong. It means there could be lots of different types, right? And like ecological politics to me means enhancing and like multiplying pleasure modes, not efficiency or like getting it right. You know, I mean, that's like petro space thinking, right? Because oil is a toxic, precious resource, you know, that creates all these horrible zero-sum games everywhere and imperialism stuff, right? But if there's like solar and wind, it's more like less life forms will be harmed and more pleasure. You know, like I can have I recently just changed my house to all wind power, yeah, because weirdly in Texas you can do that, yeah. And like, my first thought about it was, oh, you're so holy and perfect. You're so good, what a good boy, you know, like I'm being very efficient and pure. And then I realized what's good about this, I can have a disco in every room of my house, you know, with like decks and strobes and full on, you know, Mr. Muhammad, you know, in one room and whoever else, you know, Frankie Knuckles in the other, all of my favorite DJs. And we'd be like less harming life forms somehow. So like actually we're enhancing the life form's pleasure as well, right? And so somehow it's like it sort of has to include, whatever kind of anarchism that is, it's like it has to include non-human beings.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Can I have a follow-up question?
Yeah.
Thank you. You've spoken a lot about people arguing over the past 200 years about whose access point to information is right. And one thing that I've really gotten from anarchy is that the access point is everywhere. The access point is everyone's consciousness.
See, this is the whole reason David Graeber started Occupy, right? Because you're standing outside a bank with a poster going, banks are evil, banks are wrong. Like, look at the world this way. And, you know, no one's really listening. Sorry. So someone's like, bollocks to this. I'm going to go and camp in Zuccotti Park. And it's not going to be everything, but I'm going to be modeling another way of coexisting, yeah? So it's a whole different game. It's like instead of like making a statement and stuff, I'm actually just modeling something, yeah? Yeah, does it make sense?
Yeah. Are you unplugging the video game console
Right
and
on.
making a new game out of it?
Right, like you
Disassembling
can
it?
play anything, right? There's so much wiggle room in the world, you know, like Buddhism, which I study very much. I'm not like anti-religion in that, to that extent. Is like there's this concept called emptiness, and what it really means is it's a feeling, you know, it's a feeling of space, which I find very, I want to find it because I feel so claustrophobic in the current situation. You know, everyone's really so beaten down.
You know,
Hello, Beth.
hello.
You've done this before.
Well, yes, we have. So I'm going to turn.
Hit me.
Actually, no, I'm not. I'm not actually interested in hitting you.
Cool.
The interesting thing about every space as an access point is that it potentially levels the politics of the not only differential access to access points, but the differential figurative force on different people. And I think that's partly what the question about the politics was about, is that that's in some way, you know, from some level of abstraction, I would agree with you, but people I know very, you know, well, who sit inside of a very different system of governance to very different and systematic effects on their ability to access points and be seen, the same access point looking at differential folks sitting in front of them, that the politics of lending one a coalition and affiliational politics to different access points are really important, and here the analysis of particular formations and their differential distribution are really important, and it's like not everything is like the same like thing, and I think that's really important. Honestly.
So like I'd like to expand that to like the 12-inch remix of it, which is sort of like one thing that shakes down from that actually is that, funnily enough, like as Cary was saying, that these worlds that we inhabit are not completely incommensurable. You know, there's a temptation that to argue that no, I know exactly, right? You didn't, and so I'm doing a 12-inch remix of it. Like I'm taking it and like adding. We can share worlds. We don't have to, but we share them in a sort of modal way that's like 10%, 20%, 30%. It's not a total zero-sum game of like all or nothing. Yeah, kind of like these overlapping systems. I think that's how Cary.
Well, I'm actually writing a book on political theory right now, and I have a really different way of thinking about all this, that in which the topography of left and right, I just don't find very. Oh no! Actually, I agree with everything you said, but I think because for those very reasons, I actually don't find the. I mean, I understand the rhetorical uses of to mobilize people of using that kind of rhetoric, but I actually think the political landscape, and this is partly based on my own experience as an animal rights activist that got me into all this academic work that I've done, or a lot of it. You know, I actually think that when we talk about politics or the political in academic settings, we're actually almost never talking about actually existing politics. We're talking about some concept or idea of the political that I think actually often doesn't bear a whole lot of resemblance to the actual complexity of the social systems in which the political operates. And so for me, people have to try to wrap their head around. I'm trying to use Luhmann to radicalize Foucault in a project that goes back to Althusser in the theorization of structural causality, because I think you have to have a requisite theory of social complexity into which you can reinsert the political later, right? To really understand kind of what the political can and can't do, what it is, what its different components are. And those components, I think, do not line up in any isomorphic way with what we tend to talk about in academic conversations around the political, right, or around the discourse of left and right. So I have a much more, in a way, kind of more mundane and sort of deflationary, in a way, I think, understanding of what the political is and how it operates. Which is why, you know, not just left and right, but the whole discourse of community, you know, I find not of much use. I prefer like what Donna Haraway calls affinity versus community as a way to map these kind of non-isomorphic alliances that are shifting and changing and mobilize different groups at different times. And all I'm trying to point to is kind of what I talked about earlier, which is I think the necessity for real political action and actually existing political situations, I think we often need a more complex vocabulary than we often use, right? Okay, now we're done. Thank you guys. And thank you guys, especially.
Okay, sorry to cut it off early. It's been a long 2 days. I think you boys have taxis to catch. It has been a long 2 days. It has to be said, first of all, that at least for myself, I have never seen such an engaged and perceptive audience in my entire life. The questions are incredible. So just some brief final thanks. First of all, to The Walker, to Nisa Mackey and Misa Jeffries especially for hosting this. It has to also be mentioned that Arseny Zhelaev's book, Avant-Garde Museology, would never have been possible without a native Minnesotan, K.K. Nielsen, who was instrumental in pushing it through. Special thanks to Joao and Zuto and Erica Love for recording the whole thing on Eflux Conversations. The Walker, and also The Walker will be, I think, blogging related articles and also posting the proceedings on the website. And really just a final huge round of applause to Arseny Zhelaev and to all of our speakers. Thanks for coming.